Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped off the transport truck at Fort Braxton, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and her transfer orders folded neatly in her breast pocket. The North Carolina sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt as she surveyed her new assignment, watching clusters of soldiers move between buildings with the practiced efficiency of a well-oiled machine. She had requested this transfer specifically, hoping for a fresh start after 18 months of recovery and rehabilitation. The doctors had cleared her for active duty 3 weeks ago, though the nightmares still came most nights, bringing with them the acrid smell of smoke and the weight of decisions made in split seconds. A group of soldiers lounged near the motor pool, their conversation carrying across the courtyard as Maria approached the main administrative building. One of them, a corporal with arms like tree trunks, noticed her approach and nudged his companions. "Paper soldier incoming," he said loud enough for her to hear. "Look at those crisp creases and that perfect posture. Bet she spent the whole war behind a desk pushing paperwork." The others chuckled, their eyes following Maria as she maintained her steady pace. She had heard it all before, this assumption that her slight frame and methodical movements meant she was soft, inexperienced, someone who had never seen real action. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward from the group, his chevrons catching the sunlight. "Welcome to Braxton," he said with mock formality. "Hope you brought your calculator and your filing skills because that is about all we need from headquarters transfers." Maria stopped walking and turned to face them, her dark eyes steady and calm. "Thank you for the welcome, Sergeant," she replied evenly. "I look forward to working with the unit." The simplicity of her response seemed to amuse them further. Rodriguez grinned and gestured to his companions. "See what I mean? All polish, no substance. Probably never held anything heavier than a clipboard. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there?" Stories like these remind us that first impressions can be dangerously wrong, and sometimes the quietest person in the room has seen the most action. Maria shouldered her duffel bag again and continued toward the administrative building, leaving the group behind her still chuckling among themselves. She had learned long ago that words were cheap, and respect was something that had to be earned through actions rather than arguments. But as she climbed the steps to report for duty, she could feel their eyes still on her back, measuring her, dismissing her, completely unaware of what lay beneath the surface of her carefully controlled exterior. The administrative building's air conditioning provided welcome relief as Maria entered the main corridor. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the polished linoleum floor. She followed the signs toward personnel, her boots clicking in a steady rhythm that echoed off the walls. Behind the reception desk sat a specialist with tired eyes and a name tag reading Williams. He looked up from his computer screen with the expression of someone who had processed 1,000 transfers and expected nothing interesting from the 1,001st. "Transfer orders," he said without preamble, extending his hand. Maria produced the folded documents from her pocket and placed them on the counter. Williams scanned them quickly, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read her previous assignment details. "Says here you are coming from Walter Reed," he noted, glancing up at her with new interest. "Medical discharge and return to duty. What was the issue, if you do not mind me asking?" "Combat stress rehabilitation," Maria replied simply. The words carried weight she did not elaborate on. Williams nodded and continued processing her paperwork, typing information into his system with practiced efficiency. The computer screen reflected in his glasses as he worked, and Maria could see her service record scrolling past in green text. "You will be assigned to Alpha Company, 3rd Platoon," he said after several minutes. "Lieutenant Morrison is your new commanding officer. Good luck fitting in with that bunch." Something in his tone suggested that fitting in might be more challenging than usual, but Maria simply thanked him and accepted her new identification card and barracks assignment. The walk to her assigned quarters took her past the motor pool again, where the same group of soldiers had expanded to include several others. They watched her approach with the lazy attention of predators sizing up potential prey. "Look who is back," Rodriguez called out. "Did they give you a nice desk job, paper soldier? Maybe something in supply where you can count inventory all day." A private named Jackson stepped forward, his chest puffed out with the false confidence of someone trying to impress his peers. "I heard she was at Walter Reed for 6 months, he said with a smirk. Probably had a breakdown reading reports. Could not handle the stress of all that paperwork." The group erupted in laughter, and Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being the target of group mockery. But beneath that surface tension lay something else, something colder and more controlled. She had faced down insurgents in Kandahar and survived 3 IED explosions. These playground bullies were nothing compared to what she had already endured. Have you ever witnessed someone surprise everyone with hidden talents? Sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary on the outside have extraordinary stories written in scars we cannot see. Maria continued toward her barracks without acknowledging their comments, but she could hear Rodriguez addressing the group behind her. "Watch this one," he said with authority. "These headquarters transfers think they can waltz in here and get special treatment because they have nice paperwork. But this is not some office building. This is the real army, and we are going to make sure she knows it." The barracks building stood 3 stories tall, its red brick facade weathered by decades of military occupancy. Maria climbed to the 2nd floor, following the room numbers until she found her assigned quarters. The door was already propped open, revealing a sparse but functional living space with 2 metal bunks, matching lockers, and a small desk near the window. Her roommate sat on the lower bunk, polishing a pair of combat boots with methodical precision. She looked up as Maria entered, offering a cautious smile that seemed genuine despite the wariness in her eyes. "You must be Santos," she said, setting aside her boots and extending her hand. "Corporal Jennifer Hayes. I heard we were getting a new transfer." Maria shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of practical experience rather than desk work. "It is good to meet you, Corporal. I hope I am not disrupting your routine too much." Hayes laughed, a sound that carried both warmth and resignation. "Routine around here gets disrupted every day, so do not worry about that. But I should probably warn you about some of the guys in our company. They can be pretty rough on new arrivals, especially transfers from medical assignments." As if summoned by their conversation, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their door. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with 2 other soldiers flanking him like bodyguards. He leaned against the frame with casual arrogance, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Maria. Well, he said with mock surprise. "Look what we have here. The paper soldier is getting settled in. Hayes, I hope you are ready to babysit someone who probably faints at the sound of gunfire." Hayes stood up slowly, her posture shifting from relaxed to defensive. "Rodriguez, maybe you should focus on your own training instead of harassing new arrivals. Last I checked, your marksmanship scores were not exactly setting any records." The comment hit its mark, and Rodriguez's casual demeanor flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. He stepped further into the room, his companions following close behind. "That is funny coming from someone who rooms with invalids," he replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Tell me, Santos, what exactly did you do to earn 6 months at Walter Reed? Have a panic attack during a training exercise? Cry yourself to sleep reading casualty reports?" Maria remained seated on her bunk, her hands resting calmly on her knees as she met Rodriguez's gaze directly. The silence stretched between them for several seconds, thick with unspoken tension. "I completed my rehabilitation as directed by my commanding officers," she said finally, her voice steady and professional. "I am here to serve with this unit to the best of my ability." Rodriguez snorted with derision. "Rehabilitation," he repeated, drawing out the word like it tasted bitter. "That is just a fancy way of saying you broke down and could not handle real military service. You belong behind a desk, not in a combat unit." Hayes stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between Rodriguez and Maria. "That is enough, Rodriguez. You do not know anything about her service record, so maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself." Rodriguez's face darkened at Hayes's intervention, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The 2 soldiers behind him moved closer, creating an intimidating presence that filled the small barracks room with palpable tension. "Stay out of this, Hayes," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This does not concern you. I am just trying to figure out what kind of liability we have been saddled with." He turned his attention back to Maria, who remained seated with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation. Her stillness seemed to frustrate him further, as if he expected tears or anger or some kind of emotional reaction he could exploit. "You know what I think, Santos," he continued, stepping closer until he loomed over her bunk. "I think you saw some combat footage on a computer screen and had yourself a little breakdown. Could not handle the reality of what real soldiers go through every day. So they shipped you off to get your head shrunk and now they are trying to dump you on us." Maria's eyes never left his face, but something shifted in her expression, a subtle hardening that spoke of depths Rodriguez could not begin to fathom. When she spoke, her voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Everyone processes their experiences differently, Sergeant," she said quietly. "Some people need more time to integrate what they have learned." Rodriguez laughed harshly. "Integrate what you have learned," he repeated mockingly. "Listen to this psychological mumbo-jumbo. You sound like one of those therapists who never spent a day in the field but thinks they understand combat stress." Hayes took another step forward, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Rodriguez, you are out of line. Back off." But Rodriguez was gaining momentum now, feeding off the attention and the perceived weakness of his target. He gestured broadly with his hands, addressing his companions as much as Maria. "This is exactly what is wrong with the modern military," he declared. "We coddle people instead of weeding out the weak links. Back in the day, someone like this would have been discharged permanently instead of wasted months of taxpayer money on feel-good therapy." One of his companions, a corporal named Mitchell, nodded eagerly. "She probably never even fired her weapon outside of basic training," he added. "All that medical leave was probably just an excuse to avoid deployment." Maria stood up slowly, her movement so controlled and deliberate that it seemed to draw all the oxygen out of the room. She was smaller than any of the men confronting her, but there was something in her posture that made Rodriguez take an involuntary step backward. "I have fired my weapon, Corporal Mitchell," she said with quiet certainty. "And I have seen deployment." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge, but Rodriguez quickly recovered his aggressive stance. He leaned forward again, invading her personal space with deliberate intimidation. "Prove it, paper soldier. Show us these mysterious combat credentials you claim to have." The tension in the small barracks room had reached a breaking point, with Rodriguez standing mere inches from Maria, his breath hot on her face as he waited for her response to his challenge. Hayes positioned herself at an angle where she could intervene if necessary, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Maria looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear her. "I do not need to prove anything to you, Sergeant Rodriguez," she said with deadly calm. "My service record speaks for itself." Rodriguez exploded with laughter, the sound harsh and mocking in the confined space. "Did you hear that?" he said to his companions. "Her service record speaks for itself. I bet it is full of commendations for filing efficiency and typing speed." Mitchell stepped forward, emboldened by Rodriguez's reaction. "Come on, Santos," he taunted. "If you are such a combat veteran, show us your war wounds. Show us some evidence that you have been anywhere near actual fighting." Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained motionless. Hayes, however, had heard enough. "You three need to get out of here right now," Hayes said firmly, moving to stand beside Maria. "This harassment has gone far enough, and I am going to report it to Lieutenant Morrison if you do not back off." Rodriguez turned his attention to Hayes with renewed aggression. "Oh, now we have the roommate playing protector," he sneered. "What are you going to do, Hayes? Write a strongly worded complaint? File a hurt feelings report?" The third soldier, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. His name was Kowalski, and he seemed less enthusiastic about the confrontation than his companions. "Maybe we should leave them alone, Rodriguez," he said uncertainly. "We have made our point." Rodriguez whirled on him with fury. "Made our point? We have not even started making our point. This paper soldier thinks she can waltz in here with her medical discharge and her therapy sessions and fit right in with real soldiers who have actually bled for this country." He turned back to Maria, his voice rising to a shout. "You want to be part of this unit? You want our respect? Then show us something real. Show us proof that you have earned the right to wear that uniform. What would you do if you were in this situation? Sometimes standing up to bullies means staying calm when everyone around you is losing control. The strongest people often appear the quietest until the moment they choose to act." Maria stood up from her bunk, her movement fluid and controlled despite the chaos surrounding her. She walked to her locker and began turning the combination lock with deliberate precision, each click echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Rodriguez watched her movements with predatory interest, convinced he was about to witness her breakdown or retreat. Mitchell and Kowalski flanked him, while Hayes remained ready to intervene. When the locker door opened, Maria reached inside and withdrew a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of her dress uniform jacket. Maria unfolded the paper with careful precision, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the hostile attention focused on her. Rodriguez leaned forward eagerly, expecting to see some mundane administrative document that would validate his assumptions about her desk-bound military service. Instead, she held up a commendation letter bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. The letterhead was unmistakable, and even from a distance, Rodriguez could see the formal language and official signatures that marked it as genuine military correspondence. "This is a Bronze Star citation," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "It was awarded for meritorious service during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan." Rodriguez's confident smirk faltered as he processed this information. A Bronze Star was not the kind of award given to administrative personnel or paper soldiers. It required actual combat service and demonstrated valor under fire. Mitchell stepped closer, squinting at the document as if he could somehow prove it was fabricated. "That could be anyone's citation," he said weakly. "You could have picked that up at a surplus store or printed it off the internet." Maria's expression remained unchanged as she reached back into her locker and withdrew a small wooden box. She opened it to reveal the actual Bronze Star medal, its bronze finish gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Beside it lay a Purple Heart, its distinctive purple ribbon and gold border immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience. Hayes gasped softly, her hand rising to cover her mouth. She had served long enough to understand the significance of what she was seeing. The Purple Heart meant Maria had been wounded in action, while the Bronze Star indicated heroism beyond the call of duty. Rodriguez stared at the medals, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first hints of something that might have been fear. Kowalski took an involuntary step backward, suddenly realizing that their target might not be the easy mark they had assumed. "Where did you serve?" Rodriguez asked, his voice lacking its earlier confidence and aggression. "Kandahar Province," Maria replied simply. 14th month deployment with the 3rd Infantry Division. My unit was responsible for convoy security and forward reconnaissance operations. The specificity of her answer and the matter-of-fact way she delivered it carried the ring of absolute truth. These were not details someone would fabricate or embellish. They were the dry, factual remnants of experiences too complex and painful for casual conversation. Have you ever seen someone completely change how others perceive them in just a few moments? Sometimes the truth is more powerful than any argument or explanation. Mitchell was still trying to salvage the situation, his voice taking on a desperate quality. "Combat support roles get medals too," he said stubbornly. "That does not mean you were actually engaging the enemy or doing anything dangerous." Maria closed the metal box and set it gently on her bunk. Then she began rolling up the sleeve of her uniform shirt, revealing her right forearm inch by inch. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like someone unveiling a work of art or a piece of evidence. As Maria's sleeve rolled higher, intricate black ink became visible against her olive skin. What emerged was not the typical military tattoo of unit insignias or patriotic symbols, but something far more sobering and significant. Thin black lines formed a precise grid pattern, each small mark carefully placed and deliberately rendered. Rodriguez found himself leaning closer despite his growing unease, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The tattoo covered most of Maria's forearm, arranged in neat rows that spoke of careful planning and methodical execution. Hayes was the first to understand what she was looking at, her sharp intake of breath audible in the quiet room. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and horror. "Those are tally marks." Each mark represented a confirmed enemy kill, recorded in permanent ink as a testament to skills and experiences that Rodriguez and his companions could barely comprehend. The rows stretched from her wrist nearly to her elbow, their number immediately apparent to anyone who took the time to count. Mitchell's earlier bravado evaporated completely as the reality of the situation became clear. He had been mocking someone whose combat experience dwarfed his own by orders of magnitude. His mouth moved soundlessly as he tried to process what he was seeing. Kowalski was already backing toward the door, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. This was not the kind of person you harassed or challenged without serious consequences. This was someone who had seen more combat action than most soldiers experienced in entire careers. Rodriguez remained frozen, staring at the tattoo as if it might disappear if he looked hard enough. His entire worldview was crumbling around him, built as it had been on assumptions and prejudices that were proving catastrophically wrong. Maria finished rolling up her sleeve and stood quietly, allowing them to absorb what they were seeing. She did not speak or gesture or make any attempt to explain or justify. The tattoo spoke for itself with brutal eloquence. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Rodriguez finally found his voice. "How many?" he asked hoarsely, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Maria looked directly into his eyes, her expression as calm and controlled as it had been throughout the entire confrontation. 43 confirmed kills, she said simply. All enemy combatants, all in direct engagement situations where it was necessary to protect my unit or complete our mission objectives. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 43 lives taken in combat, each one representing a moment of life-or-death decision-making under conditions of extreme stress and danger. These were not video game statistics or training scenarios, but real human beings who had died because Maria Santos was exceptionally good at her job. This reminds us that everyone has hidden depths, and sometimes the quietest person in the room has seen the most action. Never judge someone's capabilities by their appearance or demeanor. Hayes sat down heavily on her bunk, overwhelmed by the revelation about her new roommate. Mitchell continued his retreat toward the door, no longer able to maintain eye contact with Maria. The revelation of Maria's kill count tattoo had fundamentally altered the atmosphere in the small barracks room. What had begun as casual harassment had transformed into something approaching a reckoning, with Rodriguez and his companions forced to confront the magnitude of their misjudgment. Rodriguez remained rooted in place, his eyes still fixed on the intricate pattern of tally marks covering Maria's forearm. Each small line represented skills honed under fire, decisions made in microseconds when hesitation meant death for herself or her teammates. Mitchell had reached the doorway but seemed unable to actually leave, as if drawn by the same morbid fascination that keeps people staring at car accidents. His earlier mockery about Maria never firing her weapon now seemed not just wrong but embarrassingly naive. Kowalski found his voice first, though it came out as little more than a whisper. 43, he repeated, as if saying the number aloud might help him process its significance. That is more than most entire platoons see in a full deployment. Maria slowly rolled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo with the same methodical precision she had used to reveal it. The gesture somehow made the moment even more powerful, as if she was putting away evidence that was too overwhelming for casual display. "You said I was afraid of gunfire," she said to Rodriguez, her voice still carrying that same deadly calm. "You said I had never held anything heavier than a clipboard." Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond but found no words. What could he possibly say that would not make his earlier statements seem even more foolish and offensive than they already were? Maria stepped closer to him, her movement controlled and deliberate. For the first time since the confrontation began, Rodriguez felt genuinely threatened. Not by her size or her physical presence, but by the absolute certainty that he was facing someone capable of violence beyond his comprehension. "I spent 14 months in Kandahar," she continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "I participated in over 200 combat operations. I was wounded 3 times, twice by IED explosions and once by sniper fire. I received commendations for valor from 4 different commanding officers." Each fact landed like a hammer blow, systematically destroying every assumption Rodriguez had made about her character and capabilities. Hayes watched in fascination as her roommate revealed layers of experience and expertise that transformed her from a quiet transfer into something approaching a legend. "The Bronze Star was for single-handedly holding a defensive position for 6 hours while my unit evacuated wounded civilians from a compound under siege," Maria said, her eyes never leaving Rodriguez's face. "The Purple Heart came when I refused medical evacuation until my team was safely extracted from an ambush situation." Mitchell finally found the courage to speak, though his voice shook with obvious nervousness. "We did not know," he said weakly. "Nobody told us about your background or your service record." Maria turned her attention to him with the same intense focus she had directed at Rodriguez. "That is exactly the problem," she replied. "You made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice and ignorance." The weight of Maria's words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, thick and suffocating. Rodriguez struggled to maintain some semblance of his earlier authority, but his voice cracked when he finally attempted to respond. "Look, Santos," he began, then stopped, realizing that any attempt at justification would only make him appear more foolish. The confident sergeant who had strutted into the room 30 minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Hayes stood up from her bunk, positioning herself where she could observe the entire scene. She had witnessed military confrontations before, but nothing quite like this systematic dismantling of assumptions and prejudices. Maria had not raised her voice or made any threatening gestures, yet she had completely dominated 3 men through nothing but truth. Kowalski edged further toward the door, his discomfort palpable in every movement. "Major Henderson is going to hear about this," he said nervously, as if invoking their commanding officer might somehow restore the natural order they thought they understood. Maria's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Major Henderson, the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. Something flickered across her face, gone too quickly for anyone to interpret, but significant enough to suggest that their commanding officer's involvement might complicate matters in ways none of them anticipated. Mitchell seized on what he perceived as uncertainty. "Yeah, the Major does not like troublemakers or people who cause disruptions in unit cohesion," he said, his confidence returning slightly. "Maybe when he hears about all this drama, he will recommend you for another transfer." Rodriguez nodded eagerly, grasping at this potential lifeline. "That is right. Major Henderson values teamwork and getting along. He does not have patience for people who come in here waving around their service records and causing problems." Maria listened to their attempts at face-saving with the same calm attention she had shown throughout the confrontation. When they finished speaking, she walked back to her locker and withdrew another document, this one in a plastic protective sleeve. Hayes recognized the format immediately. It was a letter of recommendation, the kind written by senior officers for soldiers being considered for promotion or special assignments. The official letterhead and multiple signatures indicated it came from very high up the chain of command. "This was written by Colonel Patricia Reeves of Special Operations Command," Maria said, holding the document so they could see the header. "She recommended me for assignment to this unit specifically because of my combat experience and leadership potential." She turned the letter around so they could read the text, though the formal military language was dense with technical terminology and specific references to classified operations. What was clear, even to casual readers, was the tone of exceptional praise and professional respect. Rodriguez stared at the letter as if it were written in a foreign language. Special Operations Command did not issue casual recommendations, and Colonel Reeves was known throughout the military as someone who did not waste words on undeserving personnel. The final paragraph caught Hayes's attention, and she read it aloud without thinking. Staff Sergeant Santos represents the finest traditions of military service and would be an asset to any unit fortunate enough to have her assigned to their command structure. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the barracks room, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of military boots moving with purpose and authority. The approaching footfalls had a rhythm that suggested someone of significant rank, each step measured and deliberate in a way that commanded attention even before the person came into view. Rodriguez's face went pale as he recognized the distinctive gait. That was Major Henderson's walk, and the timing could not have been worse. Here they were, caught in the middle of what could only be described as harassment of a new unit member, with evidence of their target's exceptional service record scattered across the room like pieces of a puzzle they had failed to solve. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, followed by 3 sharp knocks that carried the weight of military protocol and barely contained impatience. Hayes immediately snapped to attention, her training taking over despite the chaotic circumstances. "Enter," she called out, her voice steady despite the tension that filled the room like smoke. Major Robert Henderson stepped through the doorway with the bearing of a career military officer who had spent decades earning respect through competence rather than intimidation. His eyes swept the room quickly, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations and making rapid decisions. He was a man in his early 50s, his graying hair cut to regulation standards and his uniform pressed with the kind of precision that spoke to personal discipline and attention to detail. The oak leaves on his collar caught the fluorescent light as he moved, and his expression remained neutral while he processed what he was seeing. "Rodriguez, Mitchell, Kowalski," he said, acknowledging each of them with a slight nod. His voice carried the kind of authority that made people straighten their spines involuntarily. "Hayes." Then his attention turned to Maria, and something shifted in his demeanor. The professional distance remained, but there was something else there, a recognition that went beyond standard military courtesy. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, and the way he spoke her name suggested he knew exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. "I trust you are settling in well with your new unit assignment." Maria came to attention with the fluid precision of someone who had performed the gesture thousands of times under conditions ranging from parade grounds to active combat zones. "Yes, sir, Major Henderson. I am grateful for the opportunity to serve with this unit." Henderson's eyes moved to the Bronze Star citation still visible on Maria's bunk, then to the recommendation letter in her hands. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Hayes caught a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was rapidly piecing together what had transpired in this room. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of hidden strength and never judging others by first impressions. Sometimes the quietest heroes have the loudest victories. "I received word from Colonel Reeves that you had arrived," Henderson said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to make it clear that high-ranking officers were paying attention to Maria's assignment. "She spoke very highly of your service record and your potential contributions to our operational readiness." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized the full implications of the situation. Major Henderson's eyes shifted from Maria to Rodriguez, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The major had not risen through the ranks by missing important details, and the defensive postures of the 3 soldiers told him everything he needed to know about what had been happening before his arrival. "Rodriguez," he said with the kind of quiet authority that made subordinates wish they could disappear entirely. "I trust you have been making Staff Sergeant Santos feel welcome in her new assignment." The question was phrased politely, but everyone in the room understood it as something closer to an accusation. Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he possibly explain that he had been systematically harassing someone who had been personally recommended by Colonel Reeves? Henderson stepped closer to Maria's bunk, his attention drawn to the Bronze Star citation and the recommendation letter. He picked up the citation with careful respect, scanning the formal language that described actions taken under enemy fire in defense of civilian populations. Kandahar Province, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 3rd Infantry Division. I served with that unit during my first deployment as a lieutenant. They saw some of the heaviest fighting of the entire war. He set the citation down gently and turned his attention back to Rodriguez, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. The major's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was steel beneath the surface that promised serious consequences for anyone who had crossed the line. Staff Sergeant Santos, Henderson said, would you mind showing me your service record tattoo? I have heard that some of our most decorated veterans choose to commemorate their service in permanent ways. Maria hesitated for just a moment, glancing at Rodriguez before rolling up her sleeve to reveal the intricate pattern of tally marks covering her forearm. Henderson examined the tattoo with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. 43 confirmed kills, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and something that might have been awe. That places you among the top marksmen in the entire theater of operations during your deployment period. Mitchell and Kowalski had both retreated as far as the small room would allow, pressing themselves against the wall as if they could somehow escape notice. They had gone from feeling superior to feeling like children caught breaking something valuable and irreplaceable. Henderson turned to face Rodriguez directly, his posture shifting into what Hayes recognized as his command voice position. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said with crisp formality, I believe you and I need to have a private conversation about unit integration and the treatment of new personnel. The words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. A private conversation with the major was never a good thing, especially when it concerned behavior that could be classified as harassment or failure to maintain unit cohesion. This is exactly the kind of moment that changes everything. When truth meets authority and bullies finally face consequences for their actions. Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. Sir, we were just getting acquainted with the new transfer. There might have been some misunderstandings about her background and qualifications. Henderson's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes suggested that he was not impressed with Rodriguez's attempt at damage control. Major Henderson's gaze remained fixed on Rodriguez for several seconds, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority and barely contained disappointment. Sergeant Rodriguez, in my 26 years of military service, I have learned that the mark of a true professional is how they treat their fellow soldiers, especially those who have sacrificed more than most people can imagine. Staff Sergeant Santos represents the finest traditions of combat service, and she deserves nothing less than complete respect from every member of this unit. Rodriguez felt his career flashing before his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Harassing a Bronze Star and Purple Heart recipient who had been personally recommended by Special Operations Command was not just poor judgment, it was potentially career-ending stupidity. Henderson turned to address Mitchell and Kowalski, who were still pressed against the wall like students caught cheating on an exam. You two will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning for a discussion about professional conduct and unit standards. I suggest you spend tonight reflecting on what it means to serve alongside genuine heroes. Both soldiers nodded frantically, grateful that their punishment seemed limited to a formal reprimand rather than something more severe. They began edging toward the door, desperate to escape before the situation deteriorated further. As for you, Rodriguez, Henderson continued, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. You will be transferred to another unit effective immediately. I will not have harassment or bullying in my command, especially directed at soldiers who have earned their place through blood and sacrifice. Rodriguez's mouth dropped open in shock. A transfer was essentially a career death sentence, marking him as someone who could not be trusted to maintain unit cohesion or treat fellow soldiers with appropriate respect. Sir, please, Rodriguez began, but Henderson cut him off with a sharp gesture. The decision is final, Sergeant. You had your chance to demonstrate leadership and professionalism, and you chose intimidation and prejudice instead. Pack your gear and report to personnel for reassignment processing. Henderson then turned to Maria with an expression that carried genuine respect and admiration. Staff Sergeant Santos, I want you to know that this unit is honored to have you assigned to our command. Your combat experience and expertise will be invaluable to our operational readiness. Thank you, Major Henderson, Maria replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. I look forward to serving with distinction and contributing to the unit's mission success. Hayes watched in amazement as the entire dynamic of the room transformed. The woman she had met just hours earlier as a quiet transfer had revealed herself to be a decorated war hero deserving of the highest respect and recognition. Sometimes the most extraordinary people appear perfectly ordinary until circumstances reveal their true nature. Remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, and some have already won more than you could imagine. Henderson gave Maria a formal salute, which she returned with crisp precision. Rodriguez slumped against the doorframe, his world forever changed by his encounter with someone whose quiet strength had exposed his weakness and ignorance.